was in kindergarten, and I suppose probably this is probably a common thing among like preschool and kindergarten age children that comes a time, at least when I was in kindergarten, every day there was a boy and a girl that were chosen, and you were a line leader, and you got the privilege of going to get the graham crackers and milk from the kitchen, which, I mean, you get put in that plate, that's a big deal. I mean, you get out of class to go get the cookies and milk. This is big stuff when you're, 5, 6 years old, right? We gravitate as humans. Some of us gravitate to leadership, to be a leader. There are others of us, and this really honestly depends on your personality a lot, but we either gravitate to leadership or we gravitate to a certain leader. And even those who love to lead, we still gravitate to certain leaders. In our system of government, the power is divided between 3 branches. But who gets all the glory? The president does. Because he's the one elected leader. He's the highest elected official in the land. We are naturally gravitate to certain political leaders. My personal favorite, part of this probably is because I was raised in Illinois, but my favorite president was Abraham Lincoln. Still is. Absolutely love Abraham Lincoln. It's an Illinois thing, Springfield was an hour south of me growing up. We went to Lincoln's New Salem. We went down to the gravesite. I've been to the gravesite a couple of different times. Oh, I love it. It's great. Right. John F. Kennedy was another one of my favorite presidents. My grandparents grew up through the Great Depression, so FDR was another one of the presidents that was one of the ones that I gravitated towards. I also love Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt set up the national park system, and that always really I loved that. Yeah, so Teddy Roosevelt was one of my favorites too. As far as a kid, the first real president, I don't remember Carter. I was born in the Carter administration, but I don't remember because I was really young. But the first one I really remember was Ronald Reagan and his presidency. He was the one that really kind of stuck in my mind as the leader. Well, he was a great leader, evidenced by his reelection campaign and how many states he won, right? Lord, he wiped it up, in business, the business world, one of the premier leaders in the business world is John Maxwell. He trains leaders how to lead. 21 Laws of Leadership, the standard for how to lead. It's just kind of who it is. In the financial realm, in Christian circles, it's Dave Ramsey, right? His Financial Peace University is unparalleled. You want to get out of debt and you want to get your finances straight, go get a hold of Financial Peace University. That will get your finances straight. We also gravitate to pastoral leaders as well. Guys like Charles Stanley, Chuck Swindoll, John MacArthur, John Piper. These guys, we kind of tendency to gravitate. I love John MacArthur. He's one of my favorites. John MacArthur's, we gravitate towards these leaders, right? We just kind of have this natural tendency to gravitate there to certain leaders. We've been going through this sermon series on learn from failure, where we're attempting to learn from the failures of Israel from Moses to the exile. And we're looking today, obviously, at leadership. We last left off in the later parts of Numbers. We fast forward through Deuteronomy. Moses has now died. Joshua has taken over, led the conquest of the promised land. and then handed the reins over to the time of the judges. The judges, guys like Samson, guys like Gideon, and we finally end up here. Through to the end of the age of the judges is where we're going to stop and pause for a second for today. And we are going to be in 1 Samuel 8 this morning. But before we get to 1 Samuel 8, I need to tell the backstory of Samuel. Because Samuel is the last in the line of the judges. He is the last judge before the kingdom is set up. Guy by the name of Eli is the priest in the tabernacle, and Elkanah, Peninnah, and Hannah are Elkanah is the husband, Peninnah and Hannah are his wives. Peninnah has bore children, Hannah is barren. But Hannah's the favorite wife. Suffice it, and yes, that is where we got your name. Suffice it to say that Elkanah, Peninnah, I have trouble pronouncing her name every time, Peninnah, and Hannah go up to make sacrifices to the Lord every year. And Elkanah notices that his wife is just really down in the dumps. She doesn't have any kids. She's barren. It says that the Lord has closed her womb. And he's like, what's wrong? And she just wants a kid. And she goes while she's there and she prays at the altar before the Lord. Now she's praying and her lips are moving, but there's no sound coming out. Eli supposes that she's had just a little bit too much wine. He's like, you need to kind of lay off the wine a little bit. And she's like, oh no, I'm not drunk. And she tells her story. And she's like, you know what, I've been praying. Doesn't tell him what she's been praying for. Just tells him that she's praying. Eli says, may the Lord grant the petition that you have brought before him today. Well, she was praying for a son. Samuel is thus born. And Hannah dedicates him to the Lord. Takes him to Eli. When he is weaned, that is going to be probably around 3 or 4 years old, right? Takes him to Eli, and they see him once a year. She brings him stuff, once a year, just to, hey, mom's here, and brings stuff. But he resides with Eli the priest in the tabernacle. 1 Samuel 7:15 says that Samuel judged Israel all his life. And he is the last in the line of the judges. Now, let us read. We're going to read first 9 verses here in chapter 8. And it came about when Samuel was old that he appointed his sons judges over Israel. Now the name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah. And they were judging in Beersheba. His sons, however, did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after dishonest gain and took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations. But the thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord. The Lord said to Samuel, listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Like all the deeds which they have done since the day I brought them up from Egypt, even to this day, in that they have forsaken me and served other gods. So they are doing to you also. Now then, listen to their voice. However, you shall solemnly warn them and tell them of all the procedure of the king who will reign over them. You see, Samuel is old, and he has appointed his sons as judge over Israel. Samuel is a judge over Israel. He is a prophet. Okay? He is a prophet of the Lord. go back and read the first 3 chapters of Samuel. Read Samuel's calling. It's awesome. It is an awesome, awesome passage. There is no doubt that the man has been called by the Lord as a prophet. Okay. But now Samuel's old. He's appointed his sons to judge over Israel. Their names are Joel and Abijah. The problem is that they pursued dishonest gain, bribes, and they perverted justice. If you go back to the beginning part of Samuel, what you'll notice is a similarity between Eli the priest and judge and Samuel. I think Eli was a judge. He was a priest at least. Eli and Samuel's sons, neither one of their sons followed their father's examples. None of them did. You see, you go back to 1 Samuel 3, and you'll read about 3 or 2. No, it's 1 Samuel 2. You'll read about all of the debauchery that Eli's sons were involved in. Again, go back and read it. They're not good dudes. Okay. But neither one of their sons followed in their father's example. There is something about a second generation preacher or prophet or priest or whatever. There's something about that second generation. I threw out the name earlier. I threw out the name Chuck Stanley, right? Who's his son? Andy Stanley, who's also a megachurch preacher. And if you listen to Chuck and you listen to Andy, they are night and day different. I have to have faith that Charles is rebuking and has rebuked his son Andy, because Andy he is out there. Andy has been quoted as in saying that the Old Testament is not relevant. You don't need it. There's something about a second generation preacher that goes awry. Did you know that Joel Osteen is a second generation preacher? Yeah, most people don't know that. Joel Osteen is a second generation preacher as well. His father founded the movement that he is a preacher in, called the Word of Faith movement. And Joel has taken that and, well, you can see what he's done with it. But this doesn't just apply to preachers. This applies to generations in general. Because the next generation needs to have their own encounter with God instead of riding on the coattails of their parents' faith. You see, it was me. I rode the coattail of my parents' faith to a certain point, and you get to a certain point that you have to own your faith. You have to have your own encounter with God. You have to own and make the choice for yourself. You can only ride the coattails of your parents' faith for so long before you have to obey or disobey. Only 2 choices. Verses 4 and 5 come together, and the elders of Israel come together, and they went to Samuel, and they said that, Samuel, you're old, and we want a king to judge us, just like all the other nations. You see, the problem here, and God says as much as you get further down the line in verses 7 to 9. God says that they have not rejected you, Samuel. They're rejecting me. But there's something deeper here that is going on, because Israel wants to be like all of the other nations. You see, Deuteronomy 32:8 talks about how God divided up the nations among the sons of God. I know your translation will probably say sons of Israel, but in actuality, hello, God calling. No, it's all good. It's all good. I love that when that happens because that's just, perfect opportunity. God calling. Hello. Heaven 777. Can I take your call? This passage reads differently in our translations than it does in the Septuagint. The Septuagint translation says, when the Most High divided the nations, he separated the sons of Adam. He set the bounds of the nations according to the number of the angels of God, sons of God. God divided the nations and gave each of the 70 different sons of God, the spiritual realm beings that we talk about, the God's ruling council. He has divided the nations up to 70 different gods, right? And this goes straight back to the Tower of Babel in Genesis 10 and 11. And the problem with that is this. All of the nations are divided among this ruling council of gods, but what was different about Israel? They were God's chosen people. And yet they're now saying they want to be like all the other nations. They don't want Creator God Yahweh as their God. They would rather suffice with a lesser God instead. That is a huge error. Huge. Because they are rejecting God. Samuel then goes and seeks God because he's just like, Samuel prayed to the Lord in verse 6. Verse 7, the Lord speaks back to Samuel and says this. He says, listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. He goes on to say, like all the deeds which they have done since the day that I brought them up from Egypt, even to this day, that they have forsaken me and served other gods. So they are doing to you also. They have not changed one bit. They are still rejecting God as king over them. He goes on, and this in verse 10 goes on through the rest of the chapter. He says this. So Samuel spoke all the words of the Lord to the people who had asked of him a king. He said, this will be the procedure of a king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and place them for himself in his chariots and among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and of fifties, and some to do his plowing and to reap a harvest, and to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will also take your daughters for perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. He will take a tenth of your seed and all your vineyards and give to his officers and to his servants. He will also take your male servants and your female servants and your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his servants. Then you will cry out in that day because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. What is a king going to require? A lot. You go back and he's going to make you. He's going to gather an army. Okay, he's going to gather an army. He's going to have you make weapons of war. He's going to take your daughters to cook for him and clean and do all these things. He's going to take the best of your fields and your vineyards. He's going to take a tenth of your seed. He's going to take your best of your young men and your donkeys for his work. Take a tenth of your flock. They're going to become his servants. And God says, then they will cry out in that day, but God will not answer. Verse 19. Nevertheless, the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel, and they said, "No, but there shall be a king over us, that we may also be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." Now, after Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the Lord's hearing. The Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to their voice and appoint them a king." So Samuel said to the men of Israel, "Go, every man to his city." We must be like the other nations. But the problem is that they're not like every other nation. They're not like every other nation. God told Samuel to listen and to appoint a king. God says, if that is what they want, give it to them. Let them have a king. It is why today we have a tendency to do the same thing. And just because we have a leader over us doesn't mean that we're rejecting God. But the fact of the matter is that we as the church are part of the royal priesthood. Peter says it. You are a royal priesthood, a holy nation. That doesn't just apply to Israel. That applies to Christians as well. Because as Romans 9, 10, and 11 talk about, we have been grafted in. We have been adopted as sons, Romans 8 says. We've been adopted into this family. It is why we have a tendency to want big name preachers and celebrity pastors. We want a visible representative like everyone or everything else. This is Israel's mistake, and we haven't really learned too much from it. We put all of our stock in these celebrity preachers and pastors, and even in the local church that happens. It just does. It's part of human nature. We look for somebody to lead over us. John Maxwell talks about people will not follow someone who they perceive has a lower leadership level than they do. They will not follow him. Will not. And we all naturally will follow a leader who has a higher leadership level than us. We just naturally follow. It's human instinct. We just naturally follow a good leader, right? The problem is that we need to be able to discern. We have to be able to discern each of these leaders, right? And what we've done in our country, and let me talk about America for a second. What we've done in our country is make the contest for president, for our king, we've made it into a makeshift pastor in search. Evangelical Christianity has turned the search for president into a pastor in chief. You're not going to find it. You're not going to find it. Because if anything we have seen in the last 20 years, if we've seen anything in the last 20 years, is that politicians are unreliable. I'm just throwing that out there. Politicians are unreliable. Yeah. And it's not that we shouldn't have godly leaders. Please don't hear me saying that. We need, oh Lord, we need godly leaders in our country. Woo, Lord. And I would dare say people who are God-fearing people in our political offices. We need God-fearing people. But what we need to not do is rest our hope and faith that they are going to save things. Because if we are resting our hope in the government, that's not much of a hope at all. I'm just throwing that one out there too. We've got to stop putting people on pedestals that they don't belong on. There is only one king who is righteous enough to be put on a pedestal, and his name is Jesus. He's the only one worthy of being on that pedestal. The only one. And he's the only one we'd better put on that level and on that pedestal. Because in the last election, we all had, it didn't matter whether you are on, it didn't matter what side you were on, the saying, we are all doomed if, fill in the blank, wins the election. Both sides are saying it. We're doomed if Biden wins. We're doomed if Trump wins. Don't rest your hope in a politician. Don't rest your hope in a man. Don't rest your hope in a pastor either. Don't rest your hope in me. Because I am not worthy to be put up on that level. If there's anything I've seen in the last 3 years about myself, is that I am not worthy to be put there. Don't do it. It's not that we shouldn't have godly leaders. Moses, Aaron, Joshua, Samuel. Samuel was a great leader. But those leaders had one thing in common. They all were completely dependent upon the Lord. And we saw a few weeks ago what happened when Moses got a little bit too big of a head and he struck a rock instead of spoke to it. You will not enter the promised land, Moses. And he didn't. The changing of the guard took place, and Joshua took Israel over the Jordan, through the Jordan, in much a similar manner that the Red Sea did. And he led them on a conquest. We need to rest in the lead of the Lord God Almighty. That is who we need to rest our hope in. I'm going to start a sentence today. Scotty's going to bring up a slide here. Israel's failure is what this is. We're going to start a sentence today. We will add to it next week, and then we will wrap this sentence up in this whole series on the 21st. Israel's failure was that they demanded a king. They wanted to be like every other nation. Let us not put our hope in any person. Let us put our hope in the Lord. Because it may not necessarily be the case in our church here, but one of the things that I have seen from my colleagues around the nation is that what has happened is that politics has made its way into churches. And it has gotten ugly in some churches. Fortunately, we do not have that here. Fortunately. But let me tell you, it is happening across the nation that politics has made its way into the church. And if you don't line up politically with something, then they leave for good. They either never go to another church again or they go to a different church. Someone that lines up with their political ideals. We need to center ourselves around one king. And that is Jesus. The big idea for today: be cautious when demanding a king, as it results, if taken wrong, it can result. That should say it can result in trading God for man. It needs to be adjusted a little bit. That happens. I sit on this for a few days, and things have a tendency to, I need to change that a little bit. It doesn't always result in that, but it can result in exchanging God for a man instead. Where are you at this morning? when we get to a place that we're demanding of God something, we need a heart check. We need to check up. So whether it's demanding a king or whatever the case may be, if we get to the point that we are delivering God ultimatums, we are demanding stuff, I want to urge you to do some prayer and reflection and see if you can discover the motives for that. Discover the motives for that, because there are some deep roots there that need to be probably taken care of. Come and talk to me. We'll see if we can work through it. But whether you need prayer, whether you need to give your life to Christ, no matter what you need, stand and sing with us.